Wartales is a wonderful game, but can present some challenging enemies, especially without having experience with the mechanics. Matthias Lund is one of these enemies, a hulking brute of a man filled with pain and anguish. He's an elite enemy in Tiltron County. In my current Iron Man playthrough, I fought Matthias twice. The first time I was learning mechanics, and he put us in a tough spot early. The second time was a no-holds-barred fight, as we needed to free one of our mercs he actually took captive. The following video is a guide of what I learned in my fights with him and the strategy I used to defeat him. I'll be covering important fight mechanics to be aware of, Matthias' different actions and how they work in battle, my approach to defeating him, and then my top 3 tips for walking out of the fight as healthy as possible. There are a few things to know as we begin the second fight. Matthias has some armor off of him due to the first meeting we had. This didn't appear to be replenished in the time I had retreated to repair and heal. His stats are scaled for my party size and strength, so he's got a massive amount of armor, really high guard, a lot of hit points, but that's due to the size of my warband. And we have 6 Valor points. The first fight had really given me some experience with his mechanics, and this was a significant help in defeating him on my second trip. I'm Tooflehoont, and I'll be your guide through this guide. Let's go ahead and discuss the important fight mechanics here. Some things you definitely need to know that will or won't happen for you that you may have experienced in the usual game. Melee attacks do not engage Matthias. That's extremely important because you have specific skills that may trigger off of the word engaged. So your melee attacks are not going to engage him at all. Knockbacks do not apply to Matthias. Whether it's a shot with a bow, a spearman attack, or a specific type of skill, Matthias is not knocked back. However, he will trigger movement effects such as barrage, as I was able to experiment with. He took the damage from that attack. Matthias' attack also requires a targeting arc first, very similar to the other two-handed hammer enemies you deal with. Let's take a look at the 2 different actions Matthias can take on his turn. Lucilla's Judgment. This applies judgment to the nearest enemy, making them Matthias' next target. Lucilla's Revenge. This will move Matthias to his target and then place a 180-degree arc down for the attack. The attack hits really hard and is going to knock all enemies hit 6 meters back. Now his order of actions are going to be as follows. His first action is Lucilla's Judgment to target the nearest enemy. Whichever is closest is the one that's going to get that target. His next action is going to be Lucilla's Revenge, as he moves within range and places his attack arc down. Finally, the third action is going to read as Lucilla's Judgment, and it's going to act the same way as he targets the nearest enemy. However, before he targets the nearest enemy, he's going to be dealing his damage from Lucilla's Revenge. So here's a pro tip for you. When you see a yellow exclamation point above a Lucilla's Judgment icon, that's letting you know the turn the damage is actually going to come down to you. Knowing when he deals damage will allow you to take whatever steps possible to either 1, avoid the damage, or 2, be sure his next closest target is who you want it to be. Okay, so how did I approach defeating him? Well, the first move was all about getting my thickest tank up near Matthias to take his judgment. In this case, we used Tate, who has the best guard and armor stat. He can drop Matthias' damage using Weakening Blow, and then he can cast Deflection on himself to drop the damage by another 70%. My thought here was all about mitigating that first hit. Weakening Blow gives us a couple of rounds of reduced damage, while Deflection adds on top of the next hit. Now, one of the most important mechanics I learned in the first encounter was that Matthias' next judgment will automatically move to the next closest enemy of his. So as I calculated my remaining moves, I needed to take into account who would be closest to Matthias between his attack and next judgment, and I had to be sure they could survive his hit. My goal was to spread his damage as best as possible across my 3 frontline fighters, 2 of whom could get 70% protection on themselves if needed. Sadly, one of my frontline fighters was unavailable this fight, due to being taken captive by Matthias in the previous attempt. The saddest part of it was that the fighter would have been able to use Deflection on himself for the reduced 70% damage. Instead, our frontline fighter without Deflection had to take the second hit. His two-handed arc still worked like all other mechanics in the game, meaning if I used my movement appropriately, I could control who his target was even more. Being able to move out of his arc and completely avoid the damage is what saved my two-handed axe user from basically dying. This is just one way to defeat Matthias. I'm sure there are plenty of others. But here are my 3 key tips for dropping this big bad voodoo daddy. Number 1. Utilize your frontline bastions for their damage reductions as you bounce Matthias' attacks between them. Number 2. Utilize the stick and move strategy to avoid his weapon arc and prevent unnecessary death to your light and medium defended attackers. Number 3. Always plan your moves carefully to be sure you define his nearest target. Remember, it's the nearest target after he swings and deals damage. Because he cannot be pushed with attacks, you won't be able to break his weapon arc like you can the other standard two-handed wielders in the game. You will take damage in this fight. I can't see a way to avoid it. The best you can do is decide where it goes and mitigate as best as possible. Understanding how his skills work was the biggest difference for me in the second fight. It allowed me to better plan who needed to be near him and when. I hope this guide helps in some way as you prepare to fight Matthias. Feel free to ask any questions you have in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer them. Until the next one, goodbye everybody.